Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for a panel discussion on preparing for the Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturation Model Certification. Next slide, please. My name is Moshe Schwartz. I am pleased to be the moderator for today's roundtable on CMMC. By way of background, I spent 15 years working on defense acquisition policy, primarily supporting Congress in drafting legislation and conducting oversight of the Department of Defense. Today, we will be talking about CMMC, spearheaded by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. CMMC maps out the cyber hygiene requirements for all contractors seeking to do business with the Department of Defense. The effort is focused on addressing some deep-seated concerns over the defense industry's cyber vulnerabilities. There is still a lot of work to be done before CMMC is ready for complete deployment. As the DoD develops the third-party accreditation process and begins building CMMC requirements into contracts sometime next year, businesses should proactively prepare. To tell you a little bit more about the current state of CMMC and what steps you can take towards compliance, I'm happy to introduce today's speakers. Next slide, please. We have an excellent panel today. Let me start by introducing David Berteau, President and CEO of the Professional Services Council, with more than 400 member companies of all sizes providing federal contract services. Mr. Berteau was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness and served 14 years in the Defense Department under 6 defense secretaries. Previously, Mr. Berteau was Senior Vice President and Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Director of Syracuse University's National Security Studies Program, and Senior Vice President at SAIC. Next, we have Dr. Morgan Dwyer, who is a Fellow in the International Security Program and Deputy Director for Policy Analysis in the Defense Industries Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. At CSIS, Dr. Dwyer focuses on issues at the intersection of technology and policy, including defense acquisition, organizational reform, space, and cyber. Prior to CSIS, she served as an analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, where she guided DoD's cyber investments through the programming and budgeting process and led department-wide strategic portfolio reviews to modernize DoD information operations, reconnaissance, and rapid acquisition capabilities. Our third panelist, John Zanni, serves as CEO of Acronis SCS, an American cyber protection and edge data security company exclusively dedicated to meeting the unique needs of the U.S. public sector. Prior to leading Acronis SCS, John held senior positions at Acronis AIG, an international company, including President, Chief Marketing Officer, Senior VP of Channel and Cloud Strategy, and Senior VP of Cloud and Hosting Sales. Before joining the Acronis family, John spent more than 4 years at Parallels and 16 years at Microsoft. He earned his BS in physics from California State University, Northridge. Next slide, please, and let me turn this over to David.
All right, thank you very much, Moshe. I appreciate that, that introduction and that overview. I am David Berteau, Professional Services Council. We do advocate on behalf of our member companies, and we serve all across the federal government, not just DoD, although DoD, if you look at the dollars, is by far the largest agency in the services contract business. Let me talk a little bit about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, and I'll cover a number of slides. Let me go to the next slide, please. I'll cover these questions. Why do we need it? What's it all about? Some of the elements of the certification program, in particular, the recently released interim final rule of the Defense Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and then get to some industry questions. And then these are questions I'll pose, but I won't answer them. We'll do that in the question and answer period. Let me go to the next slide. At PSC, we've been following this actually well before CMMC came into business and attempting to shape and influence it. And it's pretty simple why. The threat, the cybersecurity threat, which is used singular here, but it's really a multiple and multifarious threat. It's very real, it's growing, and it's pretty clear that what we're doing now is not enough. So more needs to be done at every level. We're focusing today on the industry level, but the same is true in the government across America and around the world. It's a national and a global problem. DoD, in its approach, is focused more narrowly and mostly focused on taking care of DoD's own interests here, but the broader national question is well served by that as well. CMMC is only the latest in an attempt by DoD to improve cybersecurity for contractors, and of course there are parallel attempts as well on improving cybersecurity inside the Department of Defense in both classified and unclassified networks. But CMMC applies only to contractors. Next slide, please. So what is CMMC? First of all, it is a certification process. It will produce a certificate, which a company will hold. And it is aimed at unclassified systems, particularly covering what DoD refers to as controlled unclassified information. And DoD is continuing to evolve what that definition is and how it applies, as well as federal contract information. The certificate is designed to reflect a way of measuring a company's ability to meet certain specified cybersecurity standards. And those standards are laid out in the CMMC model, but would be subject to change over time because, as I mentioned, the threat is evolving as well. So it certifies companies at one of 5 specified maturity levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. It will require that DoD, the certification program, is designed to support a requirement that DoD, before it awards a contract, has to confirm that the company to which the contract is being awarded possesses a valid CMMC certificate at the designated level in the contract. There's a lot of implications in that sentence. We'll come into that a little bit more in the implementation. And it is being implemented over time. DoD is fond of saying there are 300,000 companies that will be affected because this is applied to not only all prime contractors, but subcontractors as down to whatever tier they have to go down to, particularly if they have access to controlled unclassified information or other types of covered material. So let me go on to the next slide. These are the elements of the CMMC overarching process, if you will, and I've broken it down by who's responsible. So DoD has undertaken the following responsibilities under CMMC. They have in fact promulgated the model. Version 1.02 is out there now. It incorporates some standards a little bit above and beyond the basic framework of the NIST standard 800-171, NIST being the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. DoD does incorporate for some of the levels additional standards. The fact that they went to version 1.02 implies that there are many more versions possible before we get to version 2. This, I think, also reflects the potential and the possibility and the reality of a changing threat environment. The second thing that DoD is doing and has done to an extent already is they set the training standards for assessments, the training standards for certification. They're also setting the training standards internally for DoD personnel at the program officer, the contracting officer level. DoD is building the initial repository for certificates. It's not fully built yet, not ready to go, but they have a plan and they're spending money on it. And obviously a repository for certificates will be critical because tens of thousands of procuring contracting officers and program officers will have to access that repository to determine whether or not a company has the requisite certificate before a contract is awarded. And DoD has negotiated a memorandum of understanding with an accreditation body, which is essential to implementation of the certification program. They've also been working on a no-cost contract with that accreditation body because a no-cost contract will allow certain things to be done that can't be done under an MOU. That accreditation body is the next bullet on the slide. So there is an existing accreditation body. It has a structure, it has a framework, it has a board, it has an acting chairman of the board, and they are undertaking the following actions along with others. Training and accrediting the third-party assessment organizations. The acronym that they use, cleverly designed, is the 3 PAOs. These are the assessment organizations. And ultimately, through a series of processes involving those assessment organizations and the companies that want to be certified, they will issue certifications. And then the key of this is within DoD, all of the program offices, those places that actually generate the needs for a contract and will manage that contract, or the contract will fit into their work, they will set the requirements of what certification level is needed on any given contract. And since there are hundreds of thousands of contract actions across DoD every year, this is a big challenge. So that's kind of the elements of the CMMC at the basic level. Let me go to the next slide, please. The place where this all comes into bear is what's in the contract. And what's in the contract depends on what's in the regulation. So the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, the DFARS, issued an interim final rule on September 29th, just last month, and that rule takes effect in 60 days. So it becomes effective on November 30th. That means it can be incorporated into contracts beginning on that day. It is an interim final rule, which means that it does take effect independent of the comments, but it also means that under the Administrative Procedures Act, there's still a comment period, and we expect a lot of comments to be submitted. PSC is already writing our comments, taking input from our member companies in terms of its challenges and concerns that they have underway. And I think in most cases, we tend to wait until the last minute to submit comments because you never know what's going to happen up until the last minute. In this case, DoD is encouraging comments to be submitted early so that they begin working on adjudicating those comments and incorporating them into the final rule, which will be published sometime after the November 30th comment deadline. It is possible that we will end up submitting 2 sets of comments, an initial set that they can start working on now, and then a final set to take advantage of whatever happens between now and November 30th. That final rule allows DoD, as I mentioned, to begin inserting CMMC requirements into DoD contracts. And this covers all contracts and all contractors and all subcontractors down to the necessary level, except for contracts, and I'm paraphrasing what's in the rule here, related to commercially available off-the-shelf COTS items. Companies will need to be, even after you get a certificate, companies will need to be recertified every 3 years. One of the concerns PSC has had all along is the threat cycle evolves way faster than 3 years. And so how does the certification process keep up with an ever-evolving threat process? There's no good answer for that question yet. And DoD anticipates, and the interim final rule sort of mandates that the full effect will occur in 5 years, October of 2025. That seems like a lot of time, but it will also fly by, and there's an awful lot of contracts that have to be covered in that 5-year period. And the initial rollout is not going fast, which is a good thing, but it will have to accelerate dramatically to cover everything as DoD anticipates trying to do. Let me go to the next slide. All of this has led to a host of questions. I actually could have probably created 7 slides with this density of text for the questions, but here are among the key ones that I think need to be answered and for which there are either multiple answers today or no good answers today. Number one is how does a company cover CMMC compliance costs? DoD has maintained very clearly that these are allowable costs, but allowable doesn't mean paid. And in particular, if you're under a fixed price contract, which more than 50% of services contracts fall in the fixed price category or the T&M category, allowability is hardly relevant. It's either built into your rates already or it's not. Second is, how do companies decide what CMMC level to aim for? And this, of course, is the question all along, because if you wait until the date of contract award to get your certificate, you're not going to get the contract, right? So you've got to anticipate what level the contract will call for, probably in advance of the RFP, the final RFP coming out. You may get some hints at this. You may get draft RFPs. You may get RFIs. You may get industry day comments. But in the end, the government makes that determination of what the required level will be, and they reserve the right to change that up until the time the RFP comes out. My experience tells me they may even change it after the RFP is out. This could be a change to the RFP. And so this is where communication with your customer becomes absolutely essential in terms of the level to aim for. And I think one of the things that we're emphasizing to the Department of Defense is you need to be clear in your communications with industry if you're going to maintain the level of competition and competence that you expect to get from the contractor community. The third question, how will programs and contracting officers decide what level to require for prime contractors and for their supplier base? DoD has maintained all along that they're not going to ask for more than what they need. My experience is contracting officers often ask for more than what they need, particularly when it comes to compliance and certifications, because it's a great way of covering any possible shortfall on their part. And so again, the jury is out on how this is actually going to be executed and implemented. The big question that pops up is, will CMMC requirements apply to non-defense contracts? Currently, no, the DFARS does not. The government has maintained all along that that is not what the civilian agencies plan to do. But we all know that there's a possibility that an event would occur that they need a new standard for cybersecurity across the federal government. and it's not unreasonable to think that they might look at the one that's existing and say, why don't we just spill that one over? So that remains something to be watched. How does it apply to non-platform companies and government services contractors? I mentioned that the initial elements of CMMC processes have been built on major platform contracts, the Pathfinder projects that DoD has undertaken to design the training standards and the assessment standards are all on platform contracts. The initial pilot programs appear to be all on platform contracts that come under the Defense Contract Management Agency. There's a lot of work still to be done on how this gets rolled out to services companies. How to adjudicate disputed assessments, that's still unresolved. And could the election affect CMMC? The election could affect anything, obviously, but it is certainly true that the folks who are active in the campaign of the challenger have made public comments about the wisdom and efficacy of CMMC that would lead one to conclude there might be some changes to CMMC. But I would submit to you that a DFARS rule is a DFARS rule, and political appointees don't get to change that. So where we are is where we're going to be, and whatever change would occur would have to go through normal regulatory processes to do that. So that's all I have. Moshe, I think on my next slide says questions, which I believe I turn back over to you, and we'll probably get into questions after Dr. Dwyer has her comments. So thank you very much for listening with me, and thanks very much for the opportunity to present here today.
David, thank you very much for that great rundown of CMMC. Before turning to specific questions, I'm going to ask the other panelists, what stands out to you most about CMMC and David's presentation? And let's start with you, Morgan, please.
Yeah, so thanks for having me here. You know, I think there's sort of three key takeaways about CMMC that really stand out to me that are not unique to CMMC, but are sort of common problems that DoD has in its approach to acquisition. The first is that we don't tend to fly before we buy. So again, I know there are some Pathfinder programs, but we haven't done a lot of piloting of the CMMC program. Why is piloting useful? In normal systems engineering design, right, you test some things out, you build some prototypes, and you learn from that, and that makes the ultimate rollout of your system faster and more effective. The same thing could happen with CMMC, but we're not taking the time up front to really pilot things. The second thing that stands out to me is we're focusing on bureaucracy and not technology. So cybersecurity is a highly technical field, but the focus of CMMC is building this third-party accreditation board and building processes around cybersecurity. Instead of focusing on, well, what technical things do we need, we're focusing on the bureaucracy again. And the third sort of common thing that stands out to me is not engineering the right incentives into the bureaucratic system. There has been some commentary, as David alluded to, on questions of whether the third-party accreditation body and the accreditors have the right incentives to be doing what might be a governmental function. And so I know the former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, Frank Kendall, has written about that. And I think there are real questions about whether we have the right incentives in this program. So those are the sort of three takeaways that I got from David's great presentation and that I have on the program.
John?
Yes, so I think what really comes out is the level of uncertainty for COTS suppliers like Acronis SCS. We provide off-the-shelf software, backup and recovery, cybersecurity, usually through a federal system integrator, so we don't hold the contracts directly. But as David pointed out, those same integrators are asking us what we're doing to get certified, so they feel that they're using software that will protect them in the future if something goes wrong. And so with that uncertainty, it takes a company like ours, the decision I've made at least, is to pursue some level of certification so that if later on the requirement comes down that a COT supplier has to have some level of certification, we're ready. The other part is that because of this uncertainty, it's pretty clear that being certified will be a competitive differentiator. And so at the end of the day, I think most businesses who deal with the government directly or indirectly will have to have some level of certification.
Thank you, John. And that's a great point, raising a big question that you have. I'm going to ask David and Morgan if you could comment. What particular questions or really big issues do you have about how CMMC will be implemented? We know that there have been a number of questions raised in a number of quarters. Morgan, you mentioned Frank Kendall, and a number of members of Congress have raised some questions. So from each of your perspectives, what questions really need to be answered and are still unclear? Maybe let's start with you, David.
Thanks, Moshe. So you mentioned Congress. You know, the House Armed Services Committee in its report language with the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act raises a whole host of questions. I read those and I said, these are great questions, but you're about a year and a half too late in asking them, because by the time your bill gets passed, the DFARS clause would already be in place and the program will already be moving forward. And so I think as with most federal programs, the real test comes in the implementation. And Morgan's mention of, you know, run this stuff and make sure you know what you're doing, the fly before you buy. Well, we've bought it, right? One thing that I would note, though, and I think all the concerns that have been raised are not only valid, but will expand over time. All the naysayers who don't like what CMMC have done have collectively failed to come up with an option that actually meets the needs of cyber security in a better way. And so what you frequently have, I think, going on here is, well, you can't replace something with nothing. So until you come up with something better, this is what we're going to do, right? And from PSC's point of view, and certainly my point of view and my experience in the government and out, is that's a very valid point. I think that what you're going to see happen is an implementation that is a little bit slower than would be desired by either the threat or the need to protect. And that lessons from that implementation will begin to answer many of the questions. John, of course, for your situation, you know, some of your customers are likely to be in that initial group, right? And so you're going to be faced with this right from the get-go. Your point about weeding out companies, right? So it's prudent, obviously, for you to be prepared to be certified at a level even before you're necessarily required to do so. And certainly that's something we've recommended that all our members do. But for a small business in particular, or one that, for example, does business with both civilian agencies where this requirement is not in place, as well as defense agencies where it will be, those companies may be put at a cost competitive disadvantage, right? Because you're now going to have costs built into your rate to comply with CMMC that will make you less competitive on a cost basis and when you're competing with a company for an agency that doesn't require CMMC certification. So I think the impact on the business base, particularly small and mid-sized businesses, is completely unanticipated here. In addition, so much of this is focused on tech data and protecting tech data packages from Chinese threat, right? But when we look at it from a services point of view, let's look at it from an operational services point of view. And Morgan, you've raised this in other forums as well, right? So DoD is constantly using data in its operations, logistics data, personnel data, coming out over unclassified internets, right? And you know, the banana vendor in Kuwait gets an order to deliver bananas. Let me tell you, that banana vendor is never going to be CMMC certified at any level, and they're not going to let the government into our system. And if you go to them and say, we're not going to buy from you unless you're certified, they're going to say, good luck finding another banana vendor. Because guess what? They don't have an open competitive marketplace, right? So now you're essentially saying, and I use bananas because it's rather frivolous, but you quickly get into the same thing, for example, in fuel and in a global commercial fuel market, right? So it's a commercial product, right? But guess what? The delivery location, the delivery time, the delivery volume of that fuel is in fact relevant operational data that needs to be protected. And so there's a whole host of issues they haven't even begun to deal with in this regard. Let's get the basics down. Let's get the initial ones done. Let's see how it works. And let's learn from these as we go. That's the best we can hope for. And maybe somebody will come up with a better idea.
Thank you. Morgan? Yeah, so as was mentioned at the beginning, before I came to CSIS, I worked as a budget analyst at OSC Cape. So one of the most important things that I think is still unclear to me is, as was mentioned, is the cost of CMMC. Why is that important from a budgetary perspective, right? So CMMC, if we're trying to accredit the, all 300,000 companies in the defense industrial base, I think it's still unclear how much of that cost is going to be passed off to the government, as David mentioned at the beginning. So there is probably going to be some cost to the government. We're building the fiscal year 22 budget right now. DoD is building that right now. And that future years defense program, the FIDIP, goes until FY26. So we're already laying in the budget. And so I would want to know how much of that budget is being allocated to CMMC, how much of that budget is being allocated to other supply chain security initiatives that are also going to affect the defense industrial base, and how does that budget allocation compare to all of our other priorities in the budget, because we have a lot of other priorities in the budget. If you don't have a good understanding of how much CMMC is going to cost for all of these companies, as a budget analyst working in OSC, it's really hard to make informed budget trade-offs across multiple priorities and multiple programs. So I think that's a big open question that needs to be resolved.
Thank you, Morgan. John, from a third-party perspective, how feasible are the requirements in CMMC for small and medium-sized businesses? And have you been able to take steps toward compliance already?
So first, I would like to say, having guidance on how to develop product and manage your operation in a secure way, I think is great, because there are a lot of companies out there who don't look at security first, and they should. But when it comes to the CMMC, you're talking about over 140 controls across 17 domains. Even for level 3, which is a bit simpler, there are cases where we just don't comply, and we'll see how the audit goes. I'll give you 2 examples. One is incident response. We're off-the-shelf software. It doesn't make much sense, and that would be very, very expensive to have a 24/7 team to deal with a security incident at a moment's notice. Given that the government has used our product for over a decade and we haven't had an issue, that would be an interesting cost, right, to Dr. Morgan's point. The second one is division of duties. We're about 40 people. We share roles. We have backups. Separation of labor like that is very, very difficult unless you're thousands of people. And so technically, if we follow the guidance to the letter, we're almost at level 3. But we'll keep working through it, and then as soon as there are auditors and people who have been trained, we'll bring them in, just so that if there is a surprise later saying we're required to have those certificates or the integrators require us to have them, we'll be ready. But it's challenging for small businesses.
Thank you, John. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'd like to ask one final question, if I may, of all the panelists. In recent months, in addition to a CMMC, we've seen a number of other cyber and supply chain requirements come down the pike, like Section 889, the ban on some Chinese telecommunications equipment. There's a raft of requirements that are in both the House and Senate versions of the NDAA, many of which are undoubtedly going to make it into an NDAA. While many of these regulations have debatable value in and of themselves individually and are easily executable, or could be executable, what impact is there when you think of the entire regulatory package on industry? Are all these regulations cohesive? Do they appear connected to a part of a larger strategy, or are we just seeing a lot of efforts that are uncoordinated that could have a much bigger impact on industry and their ability to execute than many people realize? I'll start this question with you, David, if I may.
Thanks, Moshe. The short answer is no, they're not integrated, they're not coherent, and this is a particular challenge for the companies. Companies are going to make sense out of it as best they can. They'll try to fit it with their existing things, but I think it makes an even greater challenge for the government itself. And one of the real unanswered questions here has been, what's the government doing to prepare its own people? I'm personally convinced that many DoD systems would not even meet level 1 certification of CMMC. And I think it'd be an important question to ask. Morgan, you may have better insight to that than I do.
I don't know if I have insight onto that particular issue, but I think it's a valid question to be asked. I think on the broader question, though, of whether we're thinking about these acquisition problems holistically. In my spare time, I teach systems engineering to grad students, and this would be like a case study in how to not systems engineer the acquisition system, right? So the answer is no, we're not thinking about these regulations holistically. We're not treating it as a system design problem. And what that comes down to is, to David's point, is it's a challenge for the government. It's a challenge for individual program managers. We're going to have to resolve trade-offs between competing priorities that have been levied on them. So it's a lot of responsibility to put on that program manager level, and asking them to make those trade-offs.
And I would add, as a business owner, first, there'll always be competing or contradictory regulation that comes out of government. My first experience, which was on a commercial property not related to cybersecurity, where one department wanted me to put trees in this location and another department said, there's a gas line there, you absolutely won't put trees there. And it's a simple case, but we had to go negotiate that, right? This is the same thing. Now, I chose to dedicate a person to following all these regulations so that we can make informed decisions of where we choose to go, with also an expectation that at some point I might have to go ask for clarity. But it would be great if there was one cohesive set of guidance across these departments, but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, thank you very much, John. I think you've all given us much to think about today. I know what I'm going to do right now this afternoon is go see how my systems are before we go any further as it applies to cybersecurity. But thank you all for joining us today, and a special thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their comments and insights on this important topic. And lastly, thank you to Acronis SCS for sponsoring this roundtable. Have a good day.